Hey there, AP European History. Welcome to the online, at-home, by yourself lecture. Can't quite call it a flexture because there's nobody there to respond to me, but I like to think of you as being right there. So if you'll just give me a big smile, then I know that we're in this together. Thank you. Great job. We're calling this one Ordinary People. We've been looking at extraordinary people up to this point. We've been looking at kings and popes and statesmen and scientists and reformers. We're going to look at the lives of people who don't often appear on the broad sweep of history. We're starting about the beginning of the 18th century, 1700, to about the beginning of the 19th century, around the year 1800. We're going to start with something called the open field system. How did these ordinary people, and I'm talking about mainly peasants, how did they live and meet their economic needs? By 1800, that's the beginning of the 19th century, the economy of Europe was still overwhelmingly agrarian. 80% of the population in Western Europe drew their lives from agriculture. We call that subsistence farming, where you grow what you need and really not that much more. Crops for the market? Yeah, sure, if there's something left over, but for the most part, you're growing only what you need. Now, most everybody is tied to the feudal system. That's the vast majority of the population in Western, Northern, and Eastern Europe. That means, by tradition and law, you can't leave. You're working for the lord of the manor. He owns the land and more or less owns you. The standard pattern of farming is called the open field. What is this? It's where you take large strips of land and you literally cut them into these long strips and you farm them according to custom and tradition, and there's no real private land ownership here. There's no this is mine and that's yours. It's open to an entire community. The remains of the open field can still be seen in this photograph right here from southwestern England. You can see those ridges, those deep trenches that were cut into the earth in order to put distinctive crops there. Now, as I mentioned before, the open field system of farming is not a terribly scientific way of using the land. It's based primarily on tradition and on custom. So one of the problems that you're going to have is soil erosion. They don't have any knowledge of nitrogen, what crops are going to deplete it, what crops are going to enrich, and so the only problem is to apply a lot of manure to your fields, and manure is actually kind of costly. It's not just, lying around, because farm animals are not always in great supply. Or to do this, to allow the fields to fallow. That means leave them alone, not use them. And as you can imagine, not using a quarter of your land or a third of your land is not going to be the best way to feed yourself, and so you're going to have a lot of unproductive land. This is going to cause, of course, a lot of problems, such as malnutrition, obviously, a low birth rate, and, as we saw with the Little Ice Age, greater susceptibility to disease. Now we hit upon something that historians have called the agricultural revolution, not to be confused with the Neolithic revolution, which you learned about in world history. The Neolithic revolution is when people first started learning how to farm. This agricultural revolution of the early 19th century, late 18th century is when we learn to farm better, when we learn to farm scientifically. The scientific revolution has a lot to do with it. People begin to ask, can we eliminate the fallow, that's the unproductive land, and can we increase productivity, make more food? And the answer is yes. Some of those projectors that Jonathan Swift and Margaret Cavendish so criticized did figure out that we can replace grain crops with nitrogen-producing crops like peas and beans and crop roots. And what this does is going to lead to something called crop rotation, the rotating of different crops to maximize the use of the soil. So instead of letting the soil just lie there and replenish itself naturally, we're going to replenish it by planting something there that will put the nitrogen back. So you can see my little chart there. You've got crop A, crop B, crop C, and crop D, and 2 of those would be nitrogen depleting, and then 2 of those would be nitrogen enriching, and all the farmer has to do is figure out which are going to be which, and he can use his soil to maximum benefit, and of course, raise more crops, feed more people, and hey, guess what? He might even have a little bit left over to sell. Now that would be something. Of course, as we can see, the result is more food. Who's leading the way? Great Britain and the Low Countries are leading the way, but some of your other countries are not too far behind. Eastern Europe, look at them. We're talking about Russia. We're talking about Poland. They are not going to be on the cutting edge of scientific discovery and evolution. They're going to stay relatively backwards into the 20th century. But keep your eye on Great Britain and the Low Countries. They are the ones that are leading the way in this agricultural revolution. You've got 2 effects of the agricultural revolution. One of them is that more food is going to become available. People are going to have more to eat. Now, the other one is called enclosure, and that's a social consequence of this. You see, when the landlord figures out that he can raise more crops and then have a greater crop yield for the market, what he does is he says, okay, this open field system in which you guys, you peasants, you had farmed according to your own needs and desires and customs and traditions, we're going to go ahead and end that. So enclosure is literally a movement to fence off or enclose the open field so that you can use the land more efficiently. And that's at the expense of the poor peasant who relied on the common field for their livelihood. And you can say, well, wait a minute, why can't the peasants live on enclosed land? It's because the more scientifically motivated landlord now, the commercially motivated landlord, is going to look at the land and say, I need to plant only peas. I need to plant wheat and peas and, I don't know, beets or something like that. Well, you can't live on just 4 foods. You can't live on just 4 crops. And what he's going to want to do is he's going to want to use the majority of that land for planting. And goodbye, the peasants have to go. So for example, my guy says here, off peasants, you have to go. I need to farm beets, and nothing but beets. Now, it doesn't have to be beets. I'm just using that as an example. But what your landlord is doing is he's responding to the market. He's not responding to the needs of his peasants or the traditions of his peasants. He's responding to a market demand for these crops. And if that's what's paying, that's what he's going to grow. And these poor peasants, they're going to have to leave. This is a pretty rare image here. I had to really look for it. I think I found it in the archives of the University of North Carolina. It shows the process of surveyors making new maps in order to document the enclosure fields of England. It's from 1795, while a surveyor and his assistants at work. And as you can see, the number of enclosures rose along with the scientific revolution. The 2 are parallel movements, your largest jump being between 1600 and 1700. And so when you take a look at a typical English community before enclosure, you see a real spectrum of ownership. the baron owns some things, and it's not all in one place. And then you've got the common land, of course, in green, which is a large portion that would be open to any peasant who wants to use it. And it's really all over the place, and there's no real rhyme or reason for who owns what land. It's, like we said, based on tradition and tradition and culture. And then after enclosure, keep your eye on it. What happens? It's much more organized. It's much more rational and much more scientifically used. What has disappeared? What color's gone? The common land is gone. And with the common land being gone, that means that your peasants have got to find something else to do and somewhere else to go. William Wordsworth is famous for many things, and among them was, of course, his poem, From the Deserted Village. Oh, I forgot to close my quotes. Sweet smiling village, loveliest of the lawn, thy sports are fled, and all thy charms withdrawn. Amidst thy bowers the tyrant's hand is seen, and desolation saddens all thy green. The only master grasps the whole domain, and half a tillage stints thy smiling pain. He's, of course, talking about the effects of enclosure. The tyrant's hand is seen, and desolation saddens all thy green. Enclosure was a good thing for the market. It was a good thing for those who owned the land, and it had disastrous consequences for those who lived on that land. Karl Marx, writing in the mid-19th century, wrote, "It is no uncommon thing for 4 or 5 wealthy graziers to engross a large enclosed lordship, which was before in the hands of 20 or 30 farmers, and as many smaller tenants and proprietors. All these are hereby thrown out of their livings with their families, and many other families who are chiefly employed and supported by them, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, wheelwrights, and other artificers and tradesmen, besides their own laborers and servants." So ownership, you can see, is falling into the hands of a few. You're seeing the wealth of a given area, and it's going into the hands of fewer and fewer and fewer people. It has an economic ripple effect. You can see that as the peasants fall into hard times, they're no longer going to be employing people such as blacksmiths and carpenters and wheelwrights and all of these other people, and so it's going to have an economic ripple effect. The poor are going to get poorer, and the wealthier are going to get wealthier. Of course, you're looking at this. This is a Marxist interpretation, and well, you might not like Marx, you might like Marx, I don't know. But in order to understand a lot of European history, you really do need to understand Marx's interpretation of events, especially as we get into the era of industrialization, and then, absolutely, as we get to the Russian Revolution. For the agricultural leaders, as we said, do you remember? Great Britain and the lowlands. You've got Holland there, and the reason why the lowlands, Holland, is going to be the leader is because they're the most densely packed, and they need to seek new means to maximize their food supply. They've got a growing urban population, and center of trade made export impossible. England, on the other hand, is Holland's best students. They employ them in swamp draining techniques. And you want to know this guy's name? His name is Jethro Tull. He's the innovator of a seed drilling technique, which helps, again, in the maximizing of agricultural technique. You're not just going to toss your seeds out and watch them fall where they might and hope for the best. Now we're going to go through and we're going to drill deep into the soil and place those seeds in there. And again, much more scientifically oriented. You can have a look at The Vegetable Market by Hendrik Slouw of 1662. This is a Dutch vegetable market, and you can see all the signs of commerce are there, and that cornucopia of food is just bursting forth, and anybody can stop and buy from that lady. This really dramatizes the sort of situation that the Low Countries are in right now. some takeaways before we move on. 1, the scientific revolution impacted farming through the introduction of new methods and new techniques. Crop yields increased and gave rise to market-oriented estate agriculture, and your best examples of that are going to be Holland and England. Now, estate owners are going to seek to maximize output by enclosing lands. Now, this means ending the traditional rights of the open field and displacing a generation of poor peasants. Are there other effects? Yes, Mr. Gillespie, there are other effects. One of those effects is the population boom. European population is going to go through some pretty big changes as a consequence of not just the agricultural revolution, but some other factors as well. Take a look. In 1700, we're looking at 120 million. By 1790, 190 million. That is a pretty big jump. Who's growing the most? Well, Russia is growing. Now, you're thinking, wait a minute, Russia didn't have an agricultural revolution, and you're right, they didn't. But keep your eyes on them. 14 million to 28 million. France, 20 to 26, 27 million. And Spain, 6 to 10 million. Why is this happening? Well, actually, the population is growing because people are dying less. The sudden, mysterious disappearance of the Black Death. Now, it's going to pop up from time to time, but as a really scary pandemic, it's going to more or less disappear by the beginning of the 18th century. Of course, you see swamp drainage for agricultural production. That does increase crop yields, and that will give people more food. But something else is when you drain swamps, guess what you do? You get rid of the home of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are a major carrier of disease. And then another factor is coming up, and that's a lot of nutritious foods from America. The potato and the tomato come to mind, and the potato, of course, is going to give us a giant population boom in where? That's right, Ireland. So you've got the 18th century population increasing, but at the same time, the number of peasants with little or no access to land is decreasing. What does this mean? It means they're going to cities. It's called urbanization. And this is a Marxist term again, the process of turning large numbers of peasant farmers into wage earners. This is called proletarianization. You've heard of the proletariat, or maybe if you studied the Russian Revolution, you've heard the term, the phrase "rise proletariat." Proletarianization. When people have to leave these farms, they have to leave their traditional way of life, and they go to cities and they have to find other means of supporting themselves. That is called the process of proletarianization. Proletarianization is best expressed through what's called the putting out system, through what's called cottage industry. When families have to leave, when they get booted off of their land, a lot of them are going to find themselves engaged in what's called cottage industry. Now, that's a stage, the definition of it is a stage in industrial development in which rural workers use hand tools in their homes to manufacture goods to sell on the market. Also known as proto-industrialization. Do not confuse this with the Industrial Revolution. This is the Industrious Revolution, or the proto-industrial movement. Cottage industry, as you can imagine, grew as enclosures made rural poverty increasingly desperate. So people are going to have to find new means of supporting themselves, and this cottage industry is how they're going to do it. Now, cottage industry is organized through what's called the putting out system. You're going to have a wealthy, usually urban, merchant capitalist. This is somebody who's got some means. Where he got his money, we don't know. But what he wants to do is he wants to invest in creating something. He wants to invest in the manufacturing of something. And so he's going to loan or put out the materials that a family is going to need to put together whatever he wants them to put together. Usually we're talking about textiles. Now, why is he hiring all those poor peasants? It's actually done to escape the high prices of the urban guilds. Now, we'll get to the guilds a little bit more in this unit here, but this is of cost benefit to him. This is when he does the cost benefit analysis, he realizes that getting these families to do this work for him is going to be of a greater benefit than staying within sort of the acceptable market. So this is kind of a black market business. Here you have a picture of the putting out system, and as you can see, it involves everybody in the family, from the head of household to the youngest child. Not that dog, apparently. Well, what sort of things did they make in the putting out system? What did the putting out system put out? They put out silverware, for example. They put out buttons. They put out clocks. And they, especially in big, bold red letters, put out textiles. These are the sort of things that people would make in their homes through the putting out system as a consequence of the end of the open field. Daniel Defoe wrote an important tract called The English Tradesman, published in 1728. Let's have a look at what he has to say. A poor laboring man that goes abroad to his day work, that's when a guy heads out and goes to his job, and husbandry, hedging, ditching, threshing, carting, etc., and brings home his week's wages, if he has a wife and 3 or 4 children to feed, and who get a little or nothing for themselves, must fare hard and live poorly. 'Tis easy to suppose it must be so. But if this poor man's wife and children can at the same time get employment, if, at the next door, or at the next village, there lives a clothier, or a bay maker, or a stuffer, drugget, weaver. I have no idea what a drugget weaver would be. Maybe you can Google that. And she gets 8 pence or 9 pence a day at home. Put it together, the family at home gets as much as the father gets abroad, and generally more. So Daniel Defoe is making a case for the benefits of cottage industry. Look how much money you can make. This alters the case extremely. The family feels it. They all feed better. That means they eat better. Are clothed warmer. And do not so easily nor often fall into misery and distress. The father gets them food, and the mother gets them clothes. And as they grow, they do not run away to be thieves and beggars, or sell themselves to the plantations in America to avoid the gaol and the gallows, but have a trade in their hands, and everyone can get their bread. What I think is interesting here as somebody who teaches U.S. history is that he mentions the process of indentured servitude. They're not going to sell themselves to the plantations in America. So Daniel Defoe really thinks that the process of enclosure is a good thing. Look at how many people are going to benefit. There's another side of this, though. This is an anonymous little poem called The Clothier's Delight. All the sorts of callings that in England be, there is none that liveth so gallant as we. Our trading maintains us as brave as a knight. We live at our pleasure and take our delight. We heapeth up richest treasure, great store, which we get by gripping and grinding the poor. And this is a way to fill up our purse, although we do get it with many a curse. Throughout the whole kingdom, in country and town, there is no danger of our trade going down, so long as the comber can work with his comb, and also the weaver weave with his loom, and the tucker and spinner that spins all the year. We will make them to earn their wages full dear. And this is a way, etc. So you can see this is a sarcastic and cynical view of the guy who runs the putting out system, the independent merchant who's going to keep these families at work. So where's the answer? Is this a system of exploitation in which families are made to work for wealthy capitalists? Or is this a system for peasants to get ahead and make some money? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. The clothier's delight continues. And first for the combers, we will bring them down from 8 groats, a score, until half a crown. If at all they murmur and say, "'Tis too small," we bid them choose whether they will work at all. We'll make them believe that trading is bad. We care not a pin, though they are ne'er so sad. And this is a way, etc. We'll make the poor weavers work at a low rate. We'll find fault where there's no fault, and so we will bait. If trading grows dead, we will presently show it. But if it grows good, they'll never know it. We'll tell them that cloth beyond the sea will not go. We care not whether we keep clothing or no. And this is a way, etc. This shift, as I mentioned before, is called the Industrious Revolution, not to be confused with the Industrial Revolution. It's a shift that occurred as families in northwestern Europe primarily focused on earning wages instead of producing goods for household consumption. Now, this reduces their economic self-sufficiency, but increases their ability to purchase consumer goods. Now, that's something we want to pay attention to. Folks are losing the control of the land. They're losing the ability to, in a sense, direct their own fate. Now, peasants really didn't have a lot of autonomy in the first place. But what we're looking at is a watershed moment in European history. For the first time, many, not yet a majority, but many, of people are dependent on a market, the ups and downs of a market, a globalized market, for their well-being rather than on the land. Takeaways, we want to make sure we know these before we move on. For the first time since the Black Death, the European population began to grow. Population growth occurred at the same time as traditional land rights were being restricted by estate owners. And poor people were increasingly participating in what's called cottage industry through the putting out system, which was a larger part of an economic shift called the Industrious Revolution, that being where people are dependent more on a market than they are on the land. So the broader consequences of this economic shift is what we get to next. I said we would get back to this guild system. A guild system, the definition is an organization of artisanal production into trade-based associations or guilds, each of which receives a monopoly over its trade and the right to train apprentices and hire workers. This guild system is an urban phenomenon. A guild would be in charge of, say, all of the shoes in a given urban area, or all of the tapestries in a given urban area, or all of the furniture in a given urban area. So their origins are in the 12th century. Their rights to control both their product, their prices, and their workers are recognized by church and state alike. And they guard the rights to exclusively produce a good. That's shoes, clocks, textiles, whatever. It'll have a guild. And so if you're a furniture maker, or if you're a shoemaker, if you're a clock maker, and you're going to operate within a certain area, within a certain market, you're going to have to talk to the guild about whether or not you've got the right to do that, whether or not they're going to let you into their guild. The reason why they don't want too many people coming in is because overproduction does what to prices? It brings down the prices. And also, they're very jealous of their product. They don't want just anybody putting a stamp on the product and calling it theirs. They want to maintain certain quality in that product as well. So this is where they run into trouble when it comes to cottage industry, and that's their jurisdiction does not extend to, change that, scratch that, their jurisdiction does not extend to rural areas. It extends to urban areas only. So make that note, not to rural areas, only to cities. Now, a lot of people want to make the association that they're labor unions. They're not labor unions. One of the FRQs I want to give you later on is to compare the rise of organized labor during the Industrial Revolution with the challenges that the guilds found during the Industrious Revolution. These are not labor unions. This is not a response to the growth of big business or to the growth of capital increasing into the hands of some. They are a system that wants to protect their traditional right to make a product and to hire who they want to hire, to apprentice who they want to apprentice, and set a price where they want to set a price. So for example, if you're looking at the governors of the Wine Merchants Guild, you're not looking at a bunch of forlorn industrial workers who are just clamoring for a decent hourly wage. You're looking at well-to-do businessmen. Now, the question that we're going to start facing in the late 18th and early 19th century is, can the cottage industry system coexist with the guild system? Well, really no. Cottage industry is going to directly compete with the guilds. Cottage industry is going to drive down prices, and it's going to draw employment and business from the cities. And the guilds are going to seek to protect and reinforce their traditional rights against this black market, which is created by cottage industry. This is a guy whose name you want to know, the French Reform Minister Anne Robert Jacques Turgot. Now, he says, we wish to abolish these arbitrary institutions, that would be the guilds, which do not allow the poor man to earn a living, which reject a sex whose weakness has given it more needs and fewer resources. He's talking about women. Which destroy the emulation and industry and nullify the talents of those whose circumstances have excluded them from membership in a corporation, which deprive the state and the arts of all the knowledge brought to them by foreigners, and which retard the progress of these arts, and which burden industry with an oppressive tax, which bears heavily on the people. Take a minute and read that over. What are Turgot's arguments against maintaining guilds? He says guilds discriminate against the poor. And he's right. They're not going to let everybody in because that is going to drive prices down. Guilds discriminate against women. No argument there. These tend to be boys' clubs. Guilds discriminate against those with actual talent. No argument there. They do. In fact, if a guild was smart, they would bring in people who had some talent, and that would increase their own prestige. But in fact, what the guilds tend to do is say, that guy is a real threat because he's got actual talent, let's prosecute him. And the last argument is that guilds are going to keep superior goods from consumers and actually constitute a tax on people with through this system. So his argument is that we should actually abolish these things and allow something more like a free labor system. You're probably most familiar with this belief expressed through the ideas of Adam Smith. We call it economic liberalism. It's the ideological belief in organizing the economy on individualist lines, meaning that the greatest possible number of economic decisions are made by individuals and not by collective institutions. That would be a guild or organizations. So, he's a Scottish philosopher, and he's a leading figure of what's going to be known as the Enlightenment. His book is an inquiry into the cause of the wealth of nations, published at the same time as the American colonies are beginning their quarrel with the British Empire, published in 1776. The argument is that free competition is preferable to guilds, which would allow workers to produce and innovate, and laborers to freely negotiate with employers. So what could be wrong with that, says Adam Smith? Free competition over some kind of organizational decision. Smith, believe it or not, was not a believer in laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term, and it really comes out of the period of the French Revolution. Adam Smith did believe that government had a role in the economy. One, which is not an economic role, but was to provide for the defense against a foreign nation. Two, maintain civil order with police and a judicial system. And three, to sponsor certain indispensable public works that private investors could not. Notice that government does have a role in providing public works when private investors cannot pull the capital together. So I almost jumped the gun here, but I'm wondering, would Adam Smith have approved of the New Deal, which was a time in which private capital was at an all-time low and unable to pull together the resources to really take the United States and the worldwide economy out of the global depression. Ways from this section. The system of cottage industry competed directly with the traditional guild system, which monopolized certain industries. Guilds sought to restrict the activity of cottage workers, thus worsening their poverty and increasing their distress. And then you have Enlightenment critics such as Turgot and Smith, who criticized guilds as stumbling blocks to progress and equality. What was the economic impact of marriage and the family? That we will take a look at in our next section. We're going to start with a couple of myths, or one big myth. Myth is that early modern couples of the late 18th and early 19th century, married early and they had lots of kids. Sometimes we tend to think that that was the reality, and only recently have we begun to have less children. The reality was that wealthy or noble people married early and had lots of children so that they could pass on title and inheritance. Poor people waited. The average age for marriage in Western Europe in the 17th, early 18th century was between 25 and 27. Why did they wait? Well, it's because children are economic units. They consume before they produce, and their entry into the world has to be monitored through community control. We can't just have all the babies that we want to, says the poor community. That would be disastrous. We have to keep the population in check or in balance with the food supply. So community control is one of these words we want to pay attention to. A pattern of cooperation and common action in a traditional village that sought to uphold the economic, social, and moral stability of a closely knit community. So moral codes are going to be upheld. Things like premarital sex are not going to be permissible, and certainly not having children out of wedlock. Marriages will be delayed and regulated. And if you're going to get married, you're going to seek the permission of the community, the consent of the church, and everybody is going to agree, because if you're going to get married and have children, you're not just entering into an agreement with another person, you're entering into an agreement with an entire community. So, illegitimacy rates are going to be very, very low. And if somebody does end up pregnant and unmarried, that is very likely to change in an early modern community. Marriage was between one mature man and one mature woman, and like we've said, at the approval of the community. You don't just do this because fancy strikes you and we're in love. You have to make sure that your economic situation is going to support you and is going to support the entry of children. So take a look at the painting The Village Wedding by Jan Steen in front of you, and you can see this community control in action. You can see that the wedding that's going on here is not just undertaken by two people. There is no such thing as eloping. There is no such thing as, forget the world. It's just the two of us and our own private happiness. Marriage and family is a community event. It's celebrated by the community, and children are an addition to not just a nuclear family, but to a community. So we have to go back to this issue of enclosure, the Industrious Revolution and cottage industry, and we ask the question, how does this affect the community? Well, how does cottage industry and the Industrious Revolution affect the community? Well, we'll start by saying that enclosures broke up villages and they split up extended families. That goes without saying. When people are kicked off of their community property, when traditional rights to the land are disrupted, that is going to disrupt the way families are organized. So the Industrious Revolution increased the rural to urban mobility and, of course, increased the purchasing power of men. It was primarily men. Disconnect from local villages means a weakening of this community control, and I think you know what's coming next. In short, the social and economic consequences of illegitimacy are greatly diminished because now you have a mobile population without the same strictures that surround premarital sex, without the same strictures that surround the sort of behavior that would be controlled in the open community. And what you're getting is a male population that's on the move and has purchasing power. Purchasing power is, well, how people eat, how people feed themselves. And so I think you can see what this is going to lead to. Weakened community control means reduced consequences for pregnancy. For men anyway. And so what happens is illegitimate births go up and up and up because women are going to be stuck with the consequences and men are just going to be able to get up and move, unfortunately. Have a look at what we're talking about. It's called the illegitimacy explosion. This is what historians refer to. It's the sharp increase in out-of-wedlock births that occurred in Europe between 1750 and 1850, caused by low wages and, of course, the breakdown of community controls. As men become the ones who are sort of the economic breadwinners, so to speak, women are going to be, for lack of a better way of explaining it, at their mercy. So the consequences are the negative imagery and associations disproportionately affect women. The social and economic consequences are also disproportionately affect women. Women are going to be the ones having the children and are not going to be able to walk away from the situation as men do. Some will, in the form of abandonment, and that we'll talk about. But by and large, it's women who are going to be, well, stuck with the consequences of premarital sex. The judicial system was also rigged to discriminate against women. I'll show you what I mean. In 1788, a group of women brought lawsuit against a single man, saying that their sexual relations with him amounted to rape because they were persuaded by him under the false pretense of marriage. The court transcript records one woman saying, "He began talking to me and said, if I would not say anything about it," obviously he's meaning their liaison, "he would marry me. He did not go away out of the room, but he quitted me. He said, if I would not mention it to my master or my mistress or anybody, he would be married to me. That was the most of his discourse, and afterwards he went away." Well, the judge ruled the seduction of these young women, now don't forget this suit was brought by a group of women, the seduction of these young women under pretense of marrying is not a crime, of much less criminality than that which you have been tried for. And you will sometime or another get your neck into the halter, that is a noose, if you do not leave off these practices. In other words, shame on you, women, for being so damn seductive. If you hadn't been willing to do this sort of thing, well, then he wouldn't have had to have lied to you about it. So, never mind the guy who went around to several young women saying he was going to do this. They should have known better because they were obviously, they were much too attractive, I guess you could say. So the social consequences, we continue. Illegitimate children are going to make women less employable. No one wants to hire a single woman. Now, I wish that had changed today, a single mother. I wish that had changed today, but and it's actually illegal to ask a woman today if she has children. It's illegal to ask anybody today at a job interview if they have children. But it's happened to me before, and I know that it's happened to my wife. At one point, she was leaving one job and going into another one, and her former boss says, well, have a nice time, and I hope you enjoy your future employment. And she goes, oh yeah, I hope you don't have too much of a time replacing me. And he says, oh yeah, well, next time we're going to find somebody who doesn't have children. Well, that could be a lawsuit if she was willing to pursue it. She didn't, but that is not something that you're to hold against a woman in today's society. And I tend to agree with that. Let's not penalize people for having children, but rather engineer a society that can accommodate and welcome children into its midst. Just my thoughts. Well, at the time, there's no such thing as public welfare anywhere. Not England, not France, not the Holy Roman Empire. All charity comes from churches and from private donations. But the social stigma increased, and churches are less likely to dispense aid to women that they find to be, well, a little bit loose with their morals. Ironically, then, this leads to a rise in, that's right, prostitution. So because women are going to be hold this social stigma, they're going to get less aid and become less employable, and they're going to turn to exactly that kind of activity which got them in trouble in the first place. So it is a big social problem. 1/3 of all babies born in Paris in the 1770s were abandoned. 1/3 of all abandoned children were born to married couples. And I thought, hey, wait a minute, Mr. Gillespie, you said they were prostitutes. Yes, I did. Just being a prostitute does not preclude that you are married. 50% of all children born in London and Paris died in 1 year. Let me repeat that statistic. 50%. It's not a typo. Of all children born in London and Paris died in 1 year. The public solution to this is going to come in what's known as a foundling hospital. First started, as far as we know, in England in the mid-18th century. A foundling hospital is essentially an orphanage where you would drop off your abandoned children. Have a look at the statistics. These are the wait times in the mid-19th century, best statistics I could find, on the application process before your child would be admitted. So a lot of people waited before they could give their child up to a foundling hospital. One such woman simply left the child on the doorstep, which was a common practice, and wrote, "I hope the gentleman will pardon this liberty, but as the mother of a little boy named John B. Woich, who is blind, praying that you will grant me permission to see him. It is my husband's wish as well as my own. It is truly hard a mother can never forget our firstborn," her firstborn. "My husband is a respectable man. He has been in his master's service 9 years, and we can both get good character references. I remain your humble servant, Ann B., 30 Ludgate Hill, housekeeper." What you're looking at below are the tokens left on the children who were abandoned. A button, a thimble, if somebody had any money, perhaps an engraving, sewn into the clothes of the children, sometimes with explicit instructions to keep this particular token on the in the children's possession as long as was possible. The hope was that one day these children could be reclaimed. Absolutely heartbreaking. As you can see from these mortality rates, in the mid-19th century, the mortality rate was appallingly high. In some foundling hospitals in Paris, I've read of, up to 90% died within the first year. Takeaways from this section are: the breakdown of community control led to an increasingly urban population in which men held greater purchasing power than women. Women were left economically and socially vulnerable, and their dependency on men who did not always keep their promises to marry them led to an illegitimacy explosion in the mid-18th, early 19th centuries. And even as illegitimacy became commonplace, the social stigma attached to single motherhood did not abate. Women were often left with little recourse other than prostitution. And of course, this leads to more unwanted children and infant mortality rates from abandonment, from disease, were so appallingly high that many private philanthropists established foundling hospitals. So how do we make sense of this? What can we say about these massive fatalities, this massive mortality rate? Well, on the one hand, Edward Gibbon, who we read about in How the Irish Saved Civilization, he wrote, "The death of a newborn child before that of its parents may seem unnatural, but it is a strictly probable event, since any of the given number of the greater part are extinguished before the 9th year, before they possess the faculties of the body and mind." A rather cold, scientific understanding of the death of a newborn. On the other hand, "Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and 3 I pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day." So you seem to have these sentiments in tension. One cool, cold indifference to the death of children, and the other one an overly sentimental attachment to dead children. What are we to make of this? Well, it depends on which class you're talking to. Have a look at an 18th century aristocratic family. Now take a closer look at their children. What do they look like to you? Do they look like children? To me, they look like little adults. They're in adult clothing. They're taking on adult engaged in adult behaviors, and they have adult expressions. It's not at all uncommon in art and in literature to depict children as miniature adults. They're not recognized as what we would think of today as children. Before the early modern period, childhood was not seen as a distinct period or as a period of distinct psychological development. It was common not even to name children until he or she was weaned, that is, could eat on his or her own and didn't have to be dependent on breast milk anymore. Upper-class women sent their children to be cared for by wet nurses, and those children would be returned when childhood was over. You see, childhood was a dangerous time to be rushed through, not cherished and enjoyed. There you have a pretty good depiction of this. Upper-class women can't be bothered by something as base and degrading as breastfeeding. But then, in the mid-18th century, a change begins to occur in the attitudes of children toward children. We begin to depict children, as in First Step 1788. Look at these cherubic little things. They've got actual baby fat. A lot of this is owing to the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote a tract called Emile in 1762. Look at what he has to say. Hold childhood in reverence, and do not be in any hurry to judge it for good or ill. Leave exceptional cases to show themselves. Let their qualities be tested and confirmed before special methods are adopted. Give nature time to work before you take over her business, lest you interfere with her dealings. You assert that you know the nature, or you know the value of time, and are afraid to waste it. You fail to perceive that it is a greater waste of time to use it ill than to do nothing, and that a child ill taught is further from virtue than a child who has learned nothing at all. You are afraid to see him spending his early years doing nothing. What? Is it nothing to be happy? Nothing to run and jump all day? Just to highlight that part there. Give nature time to work before you take over her business, lest you interfere with her dealings. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says, let the flower bloom, let the child develop. Childhood is a time to be relished and sentimentalized, not a time to be rushed through and forgotten. So childhood goes through several changes in the early modern period. Places begin to establish elementary schools, the British, the French, but especially the Germans. Now, they're not public schools as we would think of today. They're private and often religious. Protestant nations, thanks to all that Bible reading, they took the lead, especially Prussia, that'd be Germany. But Catholics also established schools as well. The use of wet nurses decreased, and it became fashionable, once again, to nurse your own child rather than outsource to a wet nurse. And you begin to see a new development in the market. Children's toys, clothing, and literature suddenly appear. And you say, where were they before? Guess what? They didn't exist. Children's toys, clothing, and literature reflects the growing realization that childhood is a distinct and important period in human development. We begin to accommodate for the psychology of childhood. And all of this leads to what? It leads to a literate public. All those elementary schools raise a generation, and then two, and then three, of people who can read. You see, in 1600, just one in 6 English and Scotsmen could write his name, and we do mean his, By 1800, 9 of 10 Englishmen and 2 of 3 Frenchmen could read. Women, of course, lagged behind, but they too were reading in larger numbers. And of course, thanks to all that Bible reading, Protestant nations led the way, and Catholic nations trailed behind, but soon followed. What were people reading in the early modern period? Now and then, the bestseller is the Bible. But beyond that, people are reading what's called chapbooks. They're cheaply produced little magazine-type things that are going to let people read into Bible stories and morality tales, fairy tales and medieval romances, true crime, and bawdy tales, that is, sex stories. And you think, wait a minute, they're reading both the Bible and stories about sex? Yeah, sure. Just think about the internet searches. What's number 1 on Google? God. What's number 2? Sex. Things have not changed. Well, what begins to happen as well is the marketplace begins to accommodate all these people with reading power and purchasing power. So the Industrial Revolution set in motion more than an increase in foodstuffs. It also increased the amount of consumer goods available. So as people lost control of their land and became subject to the market economy, they gained purchasing power. They can get things like clothing, housewares, furniture, tapestries, dishes, artwork, books, decorative pieces. This is known as the Consumer Revolution, the wide-ranging growth in consumption and new attitudes towards consumer goods that emerged in the cities of northwestern Europe in the second half of the 18th century. An early example of this, not to overstress the point, I think comes from Holland, from the Netherlands, with the paintings of Rembrandt, the portraits. Who are these people? Well, guess what? They're not kings and queens. They're not nobility. These are merchants. These are the up-and-coming capitalists. These are the folks who paid to have their portraits made. And Rembrandt made his money supplying them with exactly what they wanted. Pictures of themselves. And fashion, clothing, hats, wigs, canes, become a staple of individuality. In 18th century, especially in France, you are what you wear. It's my favorite. So think for a minute about the consequences of this consumer-centered approach to identity. Think about how things were under the old system of community control and under a system in which a village or a parish church was your identity. The consequences today, we've taken this and we've run with it. Today we've got iPods. We had MySpace. We're talking about Facebook, where you can post whatever it is you're doing at any given moment, and anybody can get on there. Look at me, I've got 10,000 friends on Facebook. I lead such a rich and interesting life. Of course, there's Twitter, which is the Reader's Digest version of Facebook. No need to write quite so much. And the latest incarnation of the narcissistic society, the Instagram. Why bother writing anything? Just have a look at how fabulous I really am. And so we've reached yet another watershed in 18th century European history. And it has to do with identity, personal self-conception, me, who I am, what I'm about, what my nature is. It's no longer quite so wrapped up in my religion or my parish church or my community or my family. It's now about my stuff, my furniture, my fashion, my art, my purchasing power. What I can go out and buy is how I identify who I am. For better or for worse, I think this is where we are today. So we're talking about the expansion of the market, the expansion of purchasing power. This emphasis on individuality gives rise to the notion of personal space, my space. I want a room of my own where I can store all of my stuff, in which I have invested my identity as a consumer with purchasing power. Those who have means begin to demand in their homes rooms with specific functions. This will be the dining room. This will be the sleeping room. This is the reading room. This is the entertaining room. And of course, the more purchasing power I have, the more rooms I can have, and the more I can add to my distinctiveness, my own personal self-worth. And this is what gives rise to the very notion of privacy. As we think about privacy, the idea that I've just got to get away from it all and have time to myself, that has its origins in the consumer revolution of the mid-18th century. As people begin to identify their self and their self-worth with their purchasing power, the notion of privacy comes right out from under that. You'll recall religion in the early modern period was a matter of doctrine. What must I believe to be saved? Catholics and Protestants both agree that it's about my personal belief, my adherence to a certain set of principles, to a catechism. Well, by the early modern period, so many churches, especially those of the Lutheran and the Anglican and even the Catholic variety, had become rigid, stone-cold defenders of the status quo, particularly the Anglican and the Lutheran churches. One German minister says the Lutheran Church had become paralyzed in forms of dead doctrinal conformity and badly needed a return to its original inspiration. This is what I call the frozen chosen church, the sort of thing where they know what they believe and they defend what they believe, but their lives reveal little about those beliefs. Of course, this is going to provoke a counter-reaction, and it begins in Germany, and it spreads to Scandinavia and to England, but it's essentially called German pietism. It de-emphasizes the role of the clergy and emphasizes, sorry I left you hanging, the role of the individual and the individual response to the gospel. It emphasizes the priesthood of all believers, that old Lutheran doctrine which says that anybody can approach the divine without the mediation of a priest or of clergy. And it's suspicious of rationality. One German pietist said, "He who wishes to comprehend God with his mind becomes an atheist." Overall, pietism promotes a warm, personal religion and the power of Christian rebirth in everyday affairs. This is John Wesley. John Wesley was an Anglican priest, and he was not happy with what he saw as the smugness of the Anglican clergy and the dry routine of Anglican worship. He found it all quite unsettling. And he has what can be described as a conversion experience at a place called Aldersgate Street. And he says, while the minister was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Now, on what did Martin Luther, depend on for his salvation? He depended on his understanding of Scripture. What does John Wesley depend on? His feelings. I felt my heart strangely warms. warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone. You know what? Maybe it's just a stretch, but when you guys talk in class, and I ask you a question, and I ask you to exercise your brains, you know what I hear more of? I felt. I feel. I never hear I think. I never hear, well, I was thinking through this. I feel that this is true, or I feel that that is true. Even when you mean I think, you always say I feel. What's that about? John Wesley, we know him today as the founder of Methodism, the Methodist Church, which is basically let's use the word again, the illegitimate child of the Anglican Church.